man, I was angry. And the man who was with her had been brought to the police station. He was violating a no contact order, had over 68 contacts with our agency, the majority of them domestic violence, no contact order, civil protection order violations. And I was mad. And I came back and I talked to him, and I kind of held it together then. Oh, sorry. Let me back up. I actually talked to him before I went to the hospital, because I remember it was after the hospital that I was angry, and not the best time to try and interview somebody. Um, but my lieutenant actually had me come out of that room, because the suspect's like, "Fuck you, bitch! You think you got enough to arrest me? Arrest me!" And I'm like, I was livid, um, and I did arrest him. He went to prison for first-degree murder.
Can you introduce yourself for me, please?
Yeah, I'm Angela Weeks.
Angela, and where did you work?
So I spent my entire law enforcement career working for the Nampa Police Department. Started actually as a college intern when I was a senior at Boise State University. Had this big vision. I was actually going to be a DEA agent. I thought I wanted to travel the world, and I wanted to work undercover narcotics. And DEA sounded really cool. So I told my supervisor over at this college, my advisor, that I wanted an internship working narcotics. And at the time, Alan Creech was in charge of our narcotics unit. He was a sergeant for the Nampa Police Department, and he was in charge of the City County Narcotics Unit, which was Caldwell Police, Nampa Police, Owyhee County, and Canyon County at the time. And they reached out to Alan, and he said, "Yeah, we'll take an intern." And so I did a part-time internship in '92 with working part-time with the narcotics unit and part-time with Tim Randall, who was working child abuse at the Nampa Police Department at the time. And they let me, I got a search warrant being an intern. I did trash. I mean, I got to do some cool stuff. And when I graduated college, got my college degree in criminal justice, they thought I looked young enough to go back to high school. So I got hired to do a 21 Jump Street gig, if you will, at Caldwell High.
Okay, so before we get into that, which I absolutely want to
Okay.
chat with you about, tell me a little bit about growing up, where you grew up, what your family life was like, what kind of
Yep.
student you were, but what was it when you were growing up that led you to law enforcement?
Yeah, so nothing. If you talk to anybody I grew up with, nobody would have picked this career for me whatsoever. I'm a native Idahoan. I was born and raised in Emmett. I was I was raised by mainly my mom. My sister and I were. My parents went through a really messy divorce when I was growing up. My dad was actually killed on a motorcycle when I was 11 years old. None of us ever got any help or counseling for all the stuff we had experienced. Just went through some really rough stuff. But I was like, nobody would ever know that about me. I was an exceptional student. I was involved in all sorts of things. I was a cheerleader. I was in track. I was in softball. Like I said, nobody would go cheerleader to taking her pom poms and going to a gun. Nobody would have ever made that connection, and I never had ever considered it. It was just never on my radar. I was the first one in my family, in my mom's family and my dad's family, to go to college. My dad's one of 12 kids. My mom's one of 8. Most of them still live over in Emmett with I think I have like 51 first cousins. Like, there's a lot of us. And I was the first one to go to college. I didn't even know, like I said, even then I wasn't even considering it. I'd always had a passion for kids, loved working with kids. I kind of thought I wanted to be a social worker until I took one social work class. And I'm like, I don't think I think like that. And actually, it was funny. I was talking to you earlier about a friend of mine that I had in college, Dustin Bloxham. We were both living in the Towers dorms our freshman year, and he was a criminal justice major. And Dustin said, I didn't do so well my freshman year. I went from being an honors student to having this freedom and a 1.8 GPA. And so Dustin's like, "Hey, if you need an easy A, take this criminal justice class." And I'm like, "What's criminal justice?" No clue, right? And part of what you had to do is you had to do a ride-along. And so I did a ride-along with a Boise police officer, 2 calls all night long. One of them was a domestic violence call, and the woman fought with the cop. And like he had blood on his hands from her trying to keep her husband from going to jail. And I'm like, what the like I didn't understand domestic violence or anything at that time. The second call was a man with a gun call. And we get a run code to it. So I get that big adrenaline, and we get there, and I can't get out of the car because of what's going on. But they put the suspect in the car with me, and he's behind me, and he's kicking my seat, and he's screaming and yelling and cussing. And I tell people, you're going to either have two reactions to that. You're going to have like this reaction of, oh my God, somebody save me. And I was like, they get paid to do this? I was hooked. I had no idea. And so then I got my internship and got to work narcotics and child abuse. And this is what I wanted to do.
Any brothers or sisters?
I do. I have one sister who's 11 months older than me. For 20 days in July, we're the same age.
And I'm assuming she didn't go into law enforcement.
Oh, no. I tell people I have some people in my family who might be on the other side at times in their lives, but nobody has ever been involved.
Yeah, so what did your mom think about you going into law enforcement?
She never really shared much about it. I remember when I was doing my internship, this was with the narcotics unit, and we were doing a buy bust, or no, it was a bypass. I can't remember why we ended up in a pursuit, but anyway, we go out there, and I'm in the back seat with the two guys I'm working with, and we end up in a pursuit, and we're right behind the guy, right? We are flipping around out by the cheese factory, coming all the way down Garrity, up into Lakeview Park, across the park. I call my mom that night, and I'm like, guess what happened to me? And she says, I don't think you should share that kind of stuff with me. I thought it was the coolest thing ever. And she was my mom. I didn't have kids at the time. She was my mom, and she didn't want to know like I did scary stuff. I think she's incredibly proud of me. We don't talk a lot about my career.
Okay.
Yeah.
Give me a female perspective in terms of, I'm assuming you're at the academy. You got to go through post, right?
Yep.
Were you the only one at the time?
No, not in post. I was the only one at Nampa.
Okay.
When I got hired, so I didn't go through I got hired in November, and I went through the academy in January.
Okay.
When I got hired in Nampa, so they'd had a female officer 15 years prior to me that she stayed for 6 months and she was gone. And then they had another one who worked traffic. She worked on the step team and for about a year, and then she became a dispatcher. And her husband, ironically, became one of my field training officers. Kind of funny, but so when I got hired, they'd never had a female who stayed on patrol more than a year. I went to the academy with, there were actually 5 females in the academy. One from Caldwell, one from Idaho County, Boise County, or maybe there were 4 of us. I can't remember. But so there were a few more over there, but none in the agency.
How was it? I mean, accepting, or did you have to any prove yourself moments with these guys?
Yes. So I don't feel like as much in the academy as actually within my own agency. I actually, even getting hired here was very interesting. So I had decided I wanted to work for Nampa, and everybody kept saying, don't put your eggs in one basket. So I tested Boise and Spokane, but I wanted to work here. I was committed to this agency for my internship. And so when I tested here, I busted my butt. I'm a competitive person. I always say when I do stuff, I don't want to just, oh, you made it. Like I wanted to be number one. And I do that with a lot of stuff. Used to be really bad about it. Not quite as bad anymore. But
Where do you think that came from?
I think it came from my childhood. I always tried to be the best because I think it allowed, now that I understand stuff about trauma, it allowed me to avoid kind of dealing with what was going on in my life. And if I could be this exceptionally, uh, great at everything kind of person, like I didn't want to just be the cheerleader. I wanted to be the head cheerleader. I didn't want to run track. I wanted to be the first place team. I've been, and when I didn't, I would quit stuff. Like I was bad at it. But so I busted my butt training. Rick Wiley, and he used to work in the narcotics program here, and he was also a patrol lieutenant for several years. Him and Alan Creech I would go running with them. Like I was working on all sorts of things, practicing my oral board skills. So there were like 127 of us that tested, and I came out number 5 on the physical. highest for a female, but I came out number 5 on the physical. On the written test, I got the highest score they'd ever had on a written test.
Mm.
And on the oral board, I got a 148 out of 150 because one of the people said that nobody deserved a perfect score. And they threw all of it out because people came forward and said that she must be sleeping with everybody in the agency. Nobody gets that good of a score. And ironically, this is a little personal. I was actually a virgin when they were saying all that. Like I had never done any of that, but it couldn't have been on my merit. It couldn't have been that I had worked super, super hard. They threw it all out, and they convinced human resources. There were some people who made some complaints that they just needed to redo the testing, and so they changed the testing procedures. And I actually had people coming to me saying, you should talk to an attorney. We know how hard you worked at this. You should talk to an attorney. You should sue the department. And I'm like, that's not how I'm going to become a cop. I'm not going to become a cop because somebody said you had to hire her.
Right.
So I retested. I retested with the new procedures, and I came out number 5 that time instead of number 1. But I came out number 5.
Still.
And well, I was telling you earlier. But I came out number 5.
When you got to number 5, were there still people giving you crap for that?
Yeah, but they hired me.
Okay.
And I learned later all these crazy rumors that were going on about who I was sleeping with. I remember one of the lieutenants telling me, he told us, somebody in the locker room, don't you think if I was sleeping with a 23-year-old, I'd be telling all of you about it? Because the rumors were still going on. I mean, Tim Randall, who was my intern supervisor, it was crazy how many of those rumors were going on. Part of it, I think, had nothing to do with me.
Yeah.
I think it had to do with the fact that I was a female in this environment that nobody was used to.
Yeah.
And people weren't used to that a female could perform at that level and do certain things in this career. And there were guys in the department who didn't want me as their backup. One of them, who's actually a very dear friend of mine, I love him to death. He was a law enforcement officer in LA during the Watts riots. He's an old school cop, right? And he went into construction for a while, and then he came up here. His name is Vic Terry, and he's just an amazing person. But Vic had an idea of what it would be like working with females. And every time we got dispatched to something, 339, 350 respond to, he's like, Nampa, could you send a third officer? Nampa, can you send a third officer? Everything we went to. He wouldn't let me search buildings with him. He made me stand in the doorway, wouldn't let me come in. This is in the beginning. I had a sergeant who said, Vic, why are you calling for a third unit? And he was never, just in case something goes wrong. Well, Vic and I had an incident where we got sent for a warrant suspect. And we're in the house, and we get to this little apartment. We get to the top of the stairs, and there's this little narrow hallway that goes this way, and then there's the stairway, and then there's this door right at the top of the stairways. Well, it's a bathroom, and he's in there. And it's one of our gang members in Nampa, and guy's about 6'2". And so Vic and I are trying to negotiate with him to come out, but Vic's got the hallway, and I'm kind of in the way of him in the stairway when he opens the door and he decides he's going to leave. And he hits me because I like have nowhere to go. So I literally just like grabbed a hold, because I'm like, well, you're not getting away. So I'm like on him like a monkey. And he runs all the way down the stairs with me hanging on to him. And I go to the bottom, and then he lands on me, and then Vic lands on him, and Vic grabs his head and he pulls it up, and he's macing the guy, and I'm still on the bottom of the pile. I get a chance to grab my mic real quick and just yell, 350, we need backup. But it's, I'm yelling because we're fighting. Ironically, my husband, one of my guys that I work with, was at my husband's job site when that happened. And my husband heard 350 on the radio yelling for help. But before the guys got there, we had him in custody. Vic never called for backup again. I think there was people that thought I was going to run, I was going to cry, I was going to give up. I mean, I don't know what they thought.
Yeah.
My sergeant said, I've watched you fight. You scared the hell out of me. But, I think, back in the day I was, well, I'm still 5'4", but back in the day I was a lot, thinner than I am now. And I don't know, they just hadn't worked with females. And I had a lot of people who would drive around the houses on backup and wouldn't come to my call. A
Wow.
lot of people said they wanted to see me get my ass kicked to see how I'd hold my own. It was interesting. And I didn't learn about some of those things till a lot later in my career when other people said, oh, yeah, he used to do this to you all the time. I had a girl who was an explorer who used to ride with the officers and watch it happen. They would just kind of watch from the down the street to see if something would happen to me.
When you were on patrol, was it just you? I mean, was it? I mean, obviously there's backup and everything
Yeah,
else,
you
but
you roll by yourself.
okay.
Yeah, yeah,
Hmm.
yeah. And I was good with it. It's like,
Yeah. So any fear once you start on patrol? Any fear about
I
being by yourself?
I don't think not necessarily being by myself, about like certain calls, like I had a snake call that I'm like, oh hell, somebody else go to that. Like, I'll go to the man with the gun call. I don't want to go to the boa constrictor call. I mean, I think any fear, law enforcement always brings fear, right? You
Sure.
don't know what you're going into, you don't know who you're dealing with. But I don't. It wasn't like I've never been afraid, even outside of this job. I'm not afraid of being by myself. Not afraid of living by myself. Not afraid of being out at night by myself. So none of that rolled into a job for me because I didn't have it before that.
Okay.
Um, I had learned I had learned fairly young that I needed to be able to take care of myself. My mom actually had told me, uh, you better not ever start a fight, but better never come home without finishing the fight. I got kicked off the cheerleading squad for fighting, but only because I was defending somebody. Like I grew up with that mentality, so it wasn't. I grew up with kind of this protector mentality. I also grew up with this mentality that I didn't take a lot of shit off anybody.
Okay. Okay. All right. So let's talk about it. I mean, you basically graduate, and before you even, if I'm looking at it right, before you even go on patrol, they figure you're so young looking, we're gonna throw you in undercover. So
Yeah.
tell me about
Yeah,
that.
we had a joke. We're going to create a business card. Young face will travel. So they wanted to do a high school program. They'd
Mhm.
tried one before, and I don't know if it wasn't very successful. So they're like, "You wanted to work undercover narcotics? We're going to give you a chance." And back then, I was like, "Oh my gosh, look how much they trust me. This is I was all in, right? I didn't think about the liability or the risk or any of it. I did have one of my college professors, though. I knew he was incredibly concerned. He actually gave me a book about somebody. I can't even remember the title of the book. The book was about a cop who had done this and they murdered him. And I mean, he was trying to scare me. He's like, you need to understand the reality of what you're getting into. And I read the whole book,
Yeah.
but it didn't stop me from wanting to do it. And so, yeah, I hung out at the high school for 2 months. We said in the beginning going in, we're only going to do 2 months. If we find nothing, great and wonderful. But here's what they did. So I had never even smoked a cigarette. I had no training whatsoever. So they took me out to the range for a week and then taught me how to use a gun. I had fired guns growing up, but like my dad holding my arms, trying to, I'd never really been. We had guns in my house even after he passed away, but never really been trained with it. So I did my firearms training. They took me down to evidence so I could see what drugs were. They took me to the Red Eye Hut so I knew more about paraphernalia. And then they got me my undercover ID and my car and like all this fake background, and I went over and registered at the school, and all of a sudden I was doing it.
What were they looking for in particular at the school?
Um, so the school itself,
No, I mean, what? Why insert you as a? I'm assuming you were a student.
yeah, I went in as a student.
Yeah. So what were they? Were they thinking that there were drugs? Is it preventative, or what was going
So
on?
I don't know that they actually knew, in all honesty.
Okay.
I think they believed I'd find something, but they did say even if she doesn't, we're pulling her out in 2 months. Great for the school if there's nothing,
Yeah.
but if there's a problem, we want to identify this. Um, so obviously there were. I go in with this. I'm an 18-year-old, transferred from Washington. Have to go in and do the whole registration at the beginning of the school. It was crazy. Got my student ID and everything. And nobody in the school knows except the principal. Nobody has any clue who I am. But I remember I told you I was born and raised in this area.
Uh huh.
My eighth grade English teacher was teaching at Caldwell High. And he knew, like, you know how you see people and you're like, man, they're so familiar. But I'm a high school student, so he isn't putting this together. There was actually a cop when I was growing up over in Jim County that was very inappropriate with some of the high school girls. Asking us, would pull us over and ask us to go hot tubbing and stuff with him. Well, he was now working in Canyon County when I was doing that undercover program, and he actually told one of the girls I went to lunch with that I was a cop because he knew where I had gone to work at. And he ended up losing his job over it. But he was hitting on her. He was doing some weird stuff.
Yeah.
But just living in this small community, I ran into, and then here's another crazy thing. While I was working undercover, we were out there. We'd gone somewhere for lunch because we had an off-campus thing, and I'm with one of the kids, and a guy I had gone to school with since grade school ran into us. And he came up, and I was still using the same first name, but I was letting them call me Angie, which I never do. I don't go by Angie, but I was going by Angie. And he came up and he's like, "Oh my God, I haven't." And I'm like, "Who are you?" And she's with me. And he's like, "Remember we went to high school together. We graduated." And I'm like, "I'm still in high school." And he's like, "You look just like her. You talk like," he won't give up. And I'm just dying because he's just like insisting because he didn't know me. He knew me since kindergarten. And so we left and she's like, "Oh my God, he was so hitting on you." And I'm like, "I know." Like I was panicked. Or forgetting what my name was, forgetting what my last name was. I remember one time I used my real name in a classroom and I wrote it on a paper. And the teacher called me up and I'm like, "That's my boyfriend's last name. And we're getting married someday. And I can use that name if I want to. Can I go to the bathroom?" And I was like, I thought I was going to throw up because I blew on my cover. I sucked at this. I sucked at maintaining the lie. It was so crazy to me.
Man.
But I arrested 16 students and
You did?
yeah, turned in names of about, I think it was about 30 other people who said, "Oh, I can get you this or I can set you up with that." I didn't get anything besides weed from the ones who sold to me.
Yeah.
But there were several others that were, trying to make deals and set things up. And maybe given them more time, they would have. But we, had this kind of time frame.
Wow.
So I would, like if I knew I was going to make a deal, we would try and like I had to skip school to come back and get my wire so we could do the deal after school. I got detention for skipping school, getting my wire on, and had a guy threaten to, well, he was a gang member, and we were going to go do the deal after school in my Chevy Sprint. And again, no training whatsoever, right? And I've got my wire on, and my team is following me, and he's like, "So I heard you're a narc." And I said, trying to play it off, and he said, "Well, I just want you to know if you're a narc, I'm going to take care of you." And I'm thinking, "Oh shit, he's reaching for his gun. Mine's under the seat. I don't think I can get to mine faster. He's already got his hand." But it scared. Nobody prepared me for this, right? Scared me to death. And that adrenaline came out, and I started driving really fast, and I lost all my cover officers. They heard that on the radio, and then I lost them. They didn't find me again until after the drug deal was gone. We'd already done it.
Wow.
Yeah. Think about the liability of that stuff.
How old are you at this time?
23 years old.
Ugh.
No training whatsoever. None. I'm sitting here now thinking back going, "Oh my God." But it was so, it feels like I've been describing somebody else's life. All the crazy things. I had a kid who was threatening to kill me, wrote letters around the school after he got arrested. My name and address were still in the phone book.
Yeah.
Like,
Probably back in the day, you just...
nobody even, like none, we didn't prepare for any of it. You know how they were having me identify people? Because some of these people I'd only deal with for like 5 minutes. So they had me go through the annual and point to people. We arrested 2 of the wrong students. When I saw them face to face, I'm like, "That's not them. Not them." But we'd taken them all to juvenile detention at that point. So we had to go get 2 of them out of juvenile detention. One of the parents actually was like, "I just want you to know, I think you guys scared my son straight. He's doing so well." But look at all the stuff that could have gone wrong with that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Okay, well, I want to get into what I would consider kind of your specialty. So just for the audience, obviously Angela worked in patrol. She was a DARE officer, school resource officer, started doing sex crime investigations, crimes against person. So at some point, I think it's fair to say that you kind of develop a passion for, I'm just going to call it the special victims
Yeah.
unit kind of stuff. Why is that? What happens?
So I had always been very passionate about kids. Like I said, even going to college, I loved working with kids. When I got to do my internship, even though I thought I wanted to do the narcotics part of it, with working the child abuse unit really uh, I actually got to do a couple of interviews. I did a confrontational, like stuff I shouldn't have been doing as an intern. They sent me out to school, West Middle School, to do this interview on my own, to do the confrontational phone call on my own. I really enjoyed working with the kids, and I felt like they needed to have somebody who represented their voice. I was very passionate about that. And so I eventually did get moved into becoming a child abuse investigator. At the time, I was the only one. My friend who used to call for all the backup and went down the flight of stairs with me volunteered to become my partner.
Wow.
Yeah, it was
Okay.
awesome. And he did that until he retired. But I um, I didn't know what I didn't know. Man, I came into those cases wanting to do the right thing. Slowly with the child abuse, but they started giving me the sexual assault and stuff. And I didn't have enough training to understand what was going on in these sexual assault cases. Tried to do the right thing for victims, but I didn't understand trauma back then. But I had two cases that were three cases that were very significant in my career that just changed my whole trajectory. My first homicide was a 4-month-old little girl who was suffocated by her dad. He held her face down in a stack of pillows till she quit crying. I thought I got a confession on that case because he told me he held her face down in a stack of pillows till she quit crying, but I didn't get him to say till she quit breathing. And I arrested him, and they dismissed the charges. And it was horrible. He had an undocumented history of domestic violence. 5 months later, I was working a case with a little girl named Natasha Duarte. She was actually already in the hospital. Her pediatrician had called me and said, "I've got real concerns about this. Nobody's listening, but I believe this subdural and chronic hematoma are abuse." So I got involved in the case, and yeah, she had been violently shaken by her babysitter, who had a history of lighting her own kids or her own family's clothes on fire and hitting her husband. And she'd violently shaken this little girl on two separate occasions. And Natasha's still alive today, but she can't speak, she can't walk. I mean, she had, it was horrific the abuse she endured and the brain surgeries. Within 2 weeks of that, I was working a case right down here on the corner of 16th and 3rd. I met this little girl, Ellen Marie Sinclair. She was on a backboard when I got there, and she had some bruises, but super faint. She about not quite 3 years old. We weren't sure what had happened to her. And she gets transported to St. Al's, and she's in back-to-back rooms with Natasha. So while I'm with her, I'm actually going in and visiting Natasha and her family. And she had been. I actually remember looking. I'm very involved in my cases. I'm a very hands-on person. I need to understand like what's happening. And so the doctor actually, I had an otoscope, and I was looking at the retinal hemorrhaging in her eyes because he was telling me she'd been shaken, and I was looking at that, and he said, she's dead, right? We're just waiting to harvest her organs. And I was, man, I was angry. And the man who was with her had been brought to the police station. He was violating a no contact order, had over 68 contacts with our agency, the majority of them domestic violence, no contact order, civil protection order violations. And I was mad, and I came back and I talked to him, and I kind of held it together then. Oh, sorry, let me back up. I actually talked to him before I went to the hospital because I remember it was after the hospital that I was angry, and not the best time to try and interview somebody. Um, but my lieutenant actually had me come out of that room because the suspect's like, "Fuck you, bitch! You think you got enough to arrest me? Arrest me!" And I was livid, um, and I did arrest him. He went to prison for first-degree murder. But those 5 cases, or those 3 cases in that 5 months, just like they were all preventable. But we needed to do things differently in our community.
Okay, so I want to talk with you about that, but before I do, you're telling me about these three cases, and I've done a lot of these interviews at this point, and so one of the things I see affects people more than anything are the child stuff.
Yeah.
How do you personally deal with the child stuff? How do you deal with the special victim unit cases? I mean, they've got to be horrific.
Yeah.
Mentally, how do you deal with that?
So better than I ever used to.
Okay.
So actually, after those 3 cases, I had an intern working with me at the time, and she had been on a couple of those with me, and so the department's like, Angela, it's not normal to have these many cases like this in 5 months. You got to go see a counselor, and they sent her with me to the counseling appointment because she'd also seen him.
Mm,
So we should both go to the same counseling appointment together. Well, I'm not going to talk about any of that in front of her, right?
right.
And the counselor was an idiot anyway. She knew nothing about what we do, right? And I don't. She's probably a great person, but cops need to talk to people who understand the work we do. Firefighters need to talk to people who understand the work we do. So she's like, "Oh, you have great coping skills. You have a really great sense of humor. You're so funny. You deal with this stuff really well." And that's the way I did that for several years, right?
Hmm.
I could laugh things off. I could pretend like stuff didn't bother me. Um, and the reality is, it does. It changes who you are. It changes when I started having kids. It changed with what I would allow them to do, who I'd allowed to be around them. But I was smart enough to know that I went to a couple sessions like that. Crazy things happened in my career where I was forced into counseling. But when I got into counseling on my own, and I got in with somebody who really knew what I was doing, when
Hmm.
I was laughing and joking about this stuff,
Hmm.
it was amazing. So I've done counseling off and on for about 15 years. I've done traditional therapy. I have done EMDR therapy. The last one I did was art. It's accelerated resolution therapy. And I'll still go back if I need to. If I need to go to counseling, I absolutely will go to counseling. One of the things I think that helped me dealing with those cases is I told people there was nothing greater than being a hero to a child, and that like motivated me, like to be able to be a voice for those kids and to tell their story, um, even for the ones who could tell their story but maybe couldn't go forward, but I could be their voice. That motivated me for my through my entire career. And I always tell people also that this is who God created me to be. He absolutely gifted me with something that I know that not everybody has. I was able to come home and kind of turn off a light switch. Not that it didn't affect me. I'm not saying that, but I didn't have nightmares about this work. I didn't wake up, going, oh my gosh, that poor scenario, or I just was really motivated to keep doing better and to keep doing more. And he just continued to pour out blessings on my life. I mean, between my husband and my kids, I was a guilty working mom, but I, I have an amazing husband that I've been with for 29 years. I have 2 adult kids who are amazing human beings. We didn't mess them up. But God was so integral in all of that for me. So I think that helped me. And then one of the things I tell people all the time, um, at the end of the day, I'm only in control of what I can do. Like I only get to control that. I don't get to control what the prosecutor's office does. I don't get to control what the jury or the judge does. And at the end of the day, when I go home and lay my head on my pillow, I need to know I did everything I could that day.
Mm,
And that brought me so much peace.
yeah.
Every day I go home, I still know I've done everything I could do at the end of that day.
Mm. When I'm assuming at some point you, I don't know if it's a realization, I don't know whether it's a whole bunch of training that you go to, but at some point, instead of kind of winging it, for a lack of a better term, you get good at this.
Yeah.
What was it? Two questions for you. What was it that you think was kind of the awakening for you, where you're like, oh, that's what I've got to do? And what would you tell officers that are working special victim cases like this that they need to? What's the biggest mistake that they make?
So I think for me, because I had been doing the child abuse and started doing this, we weren't assigning domestic violence cases or anything up in detectives when I was a detective. That's changed. We assigned those cases now, but I recognized that I needed to get more training because I just really believe that we can't keep going out to the same house 68 times and then have a little girl die from this. So I started going to trainings, and actually our shelter at the time, I think some people there, they either went, she's a real screw up, or we see some potential in her. I don't know which one they thought I was, but they're like, hey, do you want to go to some free training with us? And I was the cop they picked to do that. And so I did. I started going to some training, and I started learning, and I started training the department, started writing policy and just changing that. And then a lot of the sexual assault cases started coming in, and those weren't going anywhere. I wasn't, because I didn't get it. I didn't get what was going on with those victims. I I was raised by a mom who led me to believe a lot of the myths about sexual assault. And so I just thought that all women thought that, and we would all, not go somewhere or do certain things, and because somehow it was our fault and not the choice of the offender. But um, it was really game changing for me when I started attending some trainings related to what our brain does related to trauma. And I would tell any officer, whether it's sexual assault, whether it's any officer, it doesn't matter if it's a person's crime or not. Trauma is trauma is trauma. Our trauma, whether you're a combat veteran, whether you're a war veteran, whether you've been through a natural disaster, whether you've dealt with trauma as a child like I did, trauma is trauma is trauma. And if you can get training on what the brain does in a traumatic situation, you will have so much more empathy for the people that you are serving, but you'll do so much better for the people you are serving, because the expectations you have for them, the reality of what they can give you and what they do remember or don't remember, will change. The way you do your documentation to document trauma as part of your case will change. It was game changing for me as a law enforcement officer to understand we make these decisions and we look at people coming from this rational, logical lens of our prefrontal cortex, but that's not where people function from trauma. That's not where the body and the brain respond from. They respond from the limbic system, and we don't get to control that. So we don't get to control if our body goes into tonic immobility and we can't yell and we can't move our body and we can't move our limbs. But how do you tell somebody, I couldn't move, I couldn't yell, I couldn't scream? Because that doesn't make sense to anybody.
Yeah.
And when you understand that, and when we can listen for that, we're like, that's evidence in my case. Why would somebody have that happen if something didn't happen to them? But it also helps us to understand our own trauma way beyond freeze, way beyond fight and flight. And that empathetic lens, that trauma-informed lens, will enhance your investigations. It'll enhance interviews. It'll enhance everything you do in your personal and professional life.
So, audience, we're kind of on a limited schedule here, just because Angela is so busy. So, before I get to the last two questions, I definitely want I want Angela to talk about kind of this where she works now and kind of what the impetus was, and I'm assuming it was just kind of because of the kind of cases you work.
Yeah.
So, what do you do now?
So I am currently the number one volunteer at the Nampa Family Justice Center. I'm the board president here. So the Nampa Family Justice Center is my baby. I actually started it out of those three cases I was talking to you about earlier. Those cases happened in 2001. And in 2002, I was the domestic violence instructor for the police academy. So they had sent me down to a conference in San Diego, California. And that's where the first Family Justice Center started. Started in San Diego, California. And I toured that Family Justice Center and went back to my hotel room. And that night, God woke me up, and I had an 8-page strategic plan written before he let me go back to sleep, of how we were going to do this in Nampa. Because I told you I was looking for a different way to do this based off of those cases I'd worked. And so I came back, and Craig Kingsbury was my lieutenant at the time. He's now the chief in Twin Falls. And I told him what I wanted to do. And so we brought the chief in, and they're like, well, it can't affect your caseload. You still got to work these cases. And I'm like, I'll still do all of this. And so I started meeting with people in the community, and to see if people thought I was crazy, and people were very supportive. And I had a community meeting. I invited all these people in and said, this is what I want to do. This is why we need to do this in the community. There was a community development block grant that one of the city people told me about. I was a cop. I didn't know anything about writing grants, but I wrote a grant. And then they're like, well, you have to present before city council. And I'm like, so I did. And the city council said, we're going to give you the largest portion of this money. We're going to give you $350,000. And by the way, we own a building in downtown Nampa. Go look at it. If it works for you, you can have it. And I'm like, well, anything will work for me. You're giving it to me, it'll work. And it was this building, and it had a lot of other stuff in it at the time. And I came down and talked to the partners in it. They were all willing to move. Like, everybody saw this vision. Everybody was on board. Partner agencies were committed to being here. And then the President Bush, the Casey Gwinn founded the original San Diego Family Justice Center. So he had gone back to DC and met with President Bush at the time, and got President Bush to set aside $20 million to fund 15 pilot projects across the country. And so initially there were like 400 and some different um, locations across the country that wanted to apply for this money, but I wanted to apply for this money, and so we decided to, and so we went down, and then they narrowed it down to like 137. There were 137 of us that actually went through the grant process. So that one was a big grant, and I remember I was shopping in. I think I was shopping in Walmart, and my chief calls and he said, "Angela, I just got a call. We're one of the sites. We got almost $1 million
Wow.
to become one of these pilot project sites." So every 120 days, we were traveling around the country, kind of, they used to say, building the plane as we were flying it, trying to figure out how to do this. And it took 2 years before we opened our doors. But this year, we've been open for 19 years. We're one of the most successful justice centers in the country. And there are over 100 of them in the country now, but they're also in 20 different countries. And it started with the 15, and not all 15 are still open, but we are. We are an accredited family justice center. We're an accredited child advocacy center. This is my heart and soul in this work. It's what I really believe I was created to do. And when I retired, I knew I was not done with this. I had bigger visions of what I wanted to see happen in our community. And our board president at the time was like, "I think you should," and I'm getting ready to leave. And so I did. And I'm working on big things. So I volunteer down here about 20 hours a week when I'm in town.
If anybody has questions for you, wants to get in touch with you about what you do, how would they get in touch with you?
So just through my email. So I actually have a consulting business, angelweeksconsulting@gmail.com, because not only do I do this, but I get to travel. Considered a, it's funny, I'm considered a nationally recognized subject matter expert.
Okay.
So I get the privilege of traveling, and I've trained the Chicago Police Department. I worked on the civil rights investigation in Louisville. I've trained in Cobb County, Georgia, Columbus, Ohio. I've trained all over the place, teaching cops how to do better for our victims.
Okay, so for the audience, I will include Angela's email in the description. If you're listening to this, I'll well, you're gonna have to listen to it and
Yeah.
get what she said, but I'll put it in the description regardless. You have time for the last two
Yep,
questions?
you're good. Yep.
Okay, so did being in law enforcement affect your family?
Yes.
How so?
So when I got married, I was a cop when I got married. So he knew sort of what he was getting into, and he actually had an interest in law enforcement. He used to come ride with me all the time on patrol. He loved that until we had the really down times. He loved when we got to run code, but the 2 hours in the middle of the night when nothing's going on and it sucks, that wasn't so fun. But he knew what he was getting into, that I was already in this career. But I remember one time he was I was working a night shift, and I was going to swing over by like one of our dispatchers' house after I got off work or something, and I didn't let him know I wasn't coming home on time because it was a Saturday morning. He's going to be sleeping in, right? I got home and he was waiting at the door, and he's like, "Where the hell have you been? Do you know how long I've been waiting? I called dispatch. They didn't know where you went. They said you didn't check 1042." He would, and they didn't. I mean, they would have sent somebody like if they had a thought, but he didn't. He was so worried, and I didn't realize how much like some of my stuff was impacting him. I remember when, um, oh my gosh, I just totally went blank on her name. She was the state police officer, last name of Huff, that was killed here in Idaho.
Mm.
I remember when she was killed. That had a huge impact on my husband. That we went to the funeral, and he, it really impacted him. But he was so supportive of the work I was doing. I remember I had an incident where a guy pulled a knife on me one night, and it was right after we got engaged, and it made me kind of go, "I don't think I want to stay in this job. Somebody wanted to kill me tonight, and I've got these great things going on." And my fiance at the time, I told him I was going to quit. And he looked at me and he said, "What are you going to do that you love as much as being a cop?" And I thought, wow, that is a lot. But it had changed. I mean, even like when I think about my kids, um, my kids weren't allowed to play in the front yard for years. weren't allowed. Like I had all these. I did let them do sleepovers, but I had like all these things that had to happen. Like we had to get together as families. We had to, we had to spend some time together. You can all come to my house, but my kids are only going to go to limited places. It changed the way my husband used to say, Angela, not everybody's a child molester. And I'm like, you don't know that. So it changes the way you look at people. But I don't think I ended up leaving this career jaded like a lot of people do,
Mhm.
because I also saw so many tremendous people wanting to do really great things in my career. Even though I've seen the worst of the worst that humans can do to each other. When you work persons crimes, I will tell you that is the worst of the worst human beings can do to each other. I mean, I have worked things that nobody ever wants to hear about. That also affected my relationship with my family. I remember having this really horrific child abuse case that I couldn't get the work done at work, so I was taking the report home to type it at home, but I was getting kind of that adrenaline rush listening to confession again. So I'm on this high and I'm telling my husband about it, and he looked at me and he said, "Don't you ever tell me something like that again. That's your world. I can't hear that kind of stuff." And I would have that even from officers I worked with. They're like, "This is why I don't work in your division. Don't tell me that kind of stuff." So it has this big impact on all of it, right? My husband, they saw me going through just some different emotional stuff from my cases, when I was shut down a little bit. But I think it also my daughter's actually a pediatric nurse now. She wants to eventually, I think, come and do work over here.
Wow.
My son actually works on site. Here's our building site coordinator. They volunteer with our Camp Hope program. So I think it's had negative and positive effects.
Yeah.
One of the things I think they've got from me, my kids have got from me, is that you don't do a job for the money. You never do a job for the money. You do something because you're created for it and you have a passion for it. If you can do that in your job, it won't be a job for you.
Yeah.
It'll just be part of who you are for the rest of your life.
Angela, great interview. Thank you
Yep.
for chatting with me.
Yeah. Thank you.